Okay, so welcome for everybody, those people on the stream as well. Apparently addressing the stream people is kind of helpful, so we should do that. We have the course. I messed up a little bit the room because it's C026, not 023, but I will fix it later. So the link to the essays is through the wiki. It's available here. Alternatively, if you go to IXC and O to the main page and type the code, which is IMT4306-2018, you will find the event as well. So you can go there. And then if you logged in, as me, you can see everybody's essays. Whoops. Where does this go? Yep. So if we go to anybody, let's pick the first one. So there are two options for having the essays. One is that it's a downloadable PDF through the link here, or the other one that is like a full text essay in the system itself. There are advantages to both. So we had a short discussion before the class that if you have some math equations or if you have some diagrams or something visual, it's much easier to just generate a PDF and have it linked. But if you have just a plain text, you may as well kind of copy and paste it into the markdown and have it as a text here. If you have it as a text here, it allows us to do some statistics, so we can, generate some calculations on the text itself, and we can do later some analysis of the length of the essays people were doing across different years and so on. So I kind of encourage you to kind of copy and paste it here, but in some cases, like with references or with some diagrams or with some equations, it's not as good as having a downloadable PDF. So having a downloadable PDF is sort of an alternative, and usually when you're reviewing somebody's work, you should review the downloadable PDF as well, because they may have additional diagrams or something that is not in the markdown, right? So you should definitely do a review and analysis of the actual well-formatted PDF. So here we see the formatted PDF, and here we see the original text as it is in the markdown. So what's gonna happen next? I would like you to use the referencing model. So instead of using the references like in text here, use the references system here. The advantage is that the same article can be referenced from multiple essays, and then we can do some analysis or some discussions of how different people used or seen a particular reference. If you do it in text, it's much harder to find of how many essays or which essays are referencing that paper, right? So for example, with the World Health Organization link, for this first link, I don't know what other essays are kind of referencing it, right? But if you make it into the references, then it automatically tracks which essays are referencing that reference. Yeah?
Yeah, when I tried that, when I wanted to add my second reference, it gave me an error.
Okay.
I was only allowed to put one reference there. So, me didn't work.
Okay, so if you see something not working, then make an issue in the issue tracker. And if you can, so if you go to the GitLab, you can sort of submit an issue in the issue tracker and give us some additional information of what that error might be, right?
Sure, I will.
One very useful thing is that if you go to, developer view and open up this, and on different browsers it's in a different place, but it always allows you to show the JavaScript console, right? So you should do that, because then you will see sort of potential error or stack traces here if something is not working correctly, right? This is sort of a very experimental system, and a lot of debugging information actually is shown up here, right? So if you go to the console, you will see a number of things not working correctly, if they are not working correctly. Currently, it sort of seems for me, for now, for this session, everything was fine, so I don't see any red stack traces. But if you do observe something not working, then go here and see if you can copy and paste some of the errors into the issue tracker, because it will help us to replicate the issue. It should work with multiple references, but you know, in some occasions it may throw some fits. There is some check which not allow you to enter the same reference twice. So if a particular article is added already into the system and you want to edit second time, it should tell you. It should tell you, okay, you know, it's already there, right? So
now I got a really close message with an error code, so
okay,
post that in the issue tracker.
Yeah, so do that. We really appreciate it. If the code is also available on Bitbucket, so if you want to you know, browse the code and fix things yourself, you're more than welcome, right? So some of you actually worked on the referencing subsystem last semester. So those people might be kind of keen. They have a to-do list of things that potentially may not work. So you may give them some suggestions of why some of the things not working. So that referencing subsystem is entirely student based. It was a student project last semester. The rest of the system is sort of maintained by us, me and Simon. But you know, feel free to get into the source code if you want to. We are migrating the system right now into the newest Angular and the newest material design libraries. There are some problems with it, and also we're migrating such that if you're not logged in, you can still do most of the things. It's just that your identity is sort of anonymous, and you're being tracked by the kind of cookies. And then if you log in, your activities as anonymous users are linked to your activities as a normal user. So because we, like for the classes, it's fine the way it is right now. Because we have to identify who is who. Like we need to know, you know, who is the author of the essay somehow. But we have kind of a commenting subsystem. So for example, you can have an event like a conference or a workshop where you don't have essays, you only have questions and comments, right? And then for people to submit questions and comments, they don't really have to log in. They can do that anonymously as well. But we don't want it to be fully anonymous because we've already tried it and people immediately abused it, right? We've tried it with the law enforcement and police officers in the conference, and they've abused it. It's like, okay, why would you do that? So we had like a voting on some sort of a name, and people were just refreshing the page and like voting multiple times, right? It's like, come on. So we need some form of tracking of the anonymous use anyway. So we kind of migrating to that. So the questions are sort of anonymous, like your name is not attached to questions or comments if you post them, but your name is attached to the essays because you know, we need to know who the author of the essay is. But when you're doing the reviews, yeah, the reviews, the name is also attached. So you are not being a kind of a completely anonymous reviewer. You're sort of a reviewer which is visible. I don't remember exactly how it is now. So if we go to an essay, and then if you go here, you can add reviews. And I believe the reviews are visible to the author of the essay, but not to anybody else. So you will not see, if you are a reviewer of a particular essay, you will not see other people's reviews until it becomes kind of public. But for initially, it is only visible to the author. Okay. So because we don't want you to get biased. So normally in a conference, if you are a reviewer on a conference, you're giving a kind of an article to review, and you will be doing it together with 2 or 3 other people, right? But you don't know what they wrote until you write your own review. So when you submit your own review, then if they already submitted their reviews, you will see everybody's reviews immediately, but you will not see it before you submit your own. Okay, so the way normally it works is you have kind of a template. So I can show you. So template for yeah. So this is usually a typical review template. So you say, what do you think overall about the article, right? So normally for the workshops and conferences, you're deciding whether the paper or the article should be published, right? So you can say, I strongly encourage the publication. I think it's a very valuable publication. I kind of less strongly accepting. You say, oh, it's a borderline. It can be improved to be accepted, or could be potentially accepted as is, but it has substantial weaknesses, right? So it's a borderline. You're not deciding for or against, but you're sort of saying borderline. And then you're saying, okay, weak reject and strong reject, right? If you say strong reject, there is no hope, right? It should be rejected. The corrections will not fix it. And weak reject is here. So usually it's sort of like a 5-scale thing. So what can happen is you may have, so if it's a 5-scale, right? So you have the middle, kind of a borderline, you have the rejections, you have the acceptance, and you have kind of a strong or a weak, a borderline, a weak, and a strong, right? So now let's say you've marked here. What might happen is the other two reviewers might say, actually, it's a very good paper. You may get you against 2 positives, right? So then you may say, why do they feel so strongly about the article being good? Maybe I missed something, right? You can get, you know, another here and another here. Then you sort of, yeah, you all kind of say, yeah, it's a borderline paper, it's not very good, right? Sometimes what happens is you really like the paper. It happened to me sometimes that I said, no, it's a strong accept, right? I really like the idea, I like the paper, and other reviewers say here or here, right? And they didn't like, for example, the style of the way the author wrote the thing, or the author didn't evaluate it, the work, right? And I said, well, okay, that's true, but the idea is very good, and the prototype they've done is very valuable, so the community should see it, and then somebody else can do evaluation, right? Maybe the evaluation is not as important as they think. And then you have a section on discussing. So when you submit your reviews, you have some sort of a discussion going on, you know, how you see each other reviews, like why some people are here, some people are here, and you can argue, right? So for example, if I was strong, positive about something, but they pointed out that, okay, the paper doesn't have that, doesn't have that, doesn't have that, doesn't have that, I may say, yeah, actually, you're right. Actually, I will change my mind and I will say, okay, it's a borderline paper because of those deficiencies, but on the positive side, it has everything which I was counting as positive, right? And then the session chair or some sort of a person in charge, some sort of a mediator, will, after the voting and after the discussion, will decide whether the paper goes in or not, right? How often it is that you have extremes, like, you know, some people having this and some people having that? Not that often, but you do get it. You get that, okay? So sometimes someone is kind of an expert in the field and the paper doesn't cite their work and they get upset. They say, come on, you know, you're doing this work in this field and you're not citing part. It might be their paper or it might be some paper, not necessarily theirs. But they say, okay, you know, they get kind of, they don't like a particular thing and they get very fixated on it, right? And they kind of go here to the negative. But it's not that often that you get extremes. But it's very often that you get some sort of a mixture of small, you know, weak accept and weak reject. And also, you know, doing this is kind of safe in a way because you don't know what other people think about the paper and you can kind of upvote your vote or downgrade your vote based on what they wrote, right? So if you're not sure about the paper, kind of going borderline is usually quite safe because you can sort of see what other people were putting attention to. You should not do that though, right? You should actually be kind of independent of others' people's opinions. So you should only do that if you really think it's sort of borderline. But sometimes it's quite hard to judge a paper. All right, so that's the first part. And then the second one is you mark your own confidence, right? How well you know the field, how well you are an expert in that domain, right? So for the papers, it depends. Like if the paper is really in your domain, you say, okay, I'm an expert, or high, 4 or 5. But sometimes you get a paper which you can read and you can understand, but you're not an expert in the field. Then you say medium, right? If you sort of have very low or none expertise in the field, you should be kind of upfront about it, and you should say, I'm only reviewing the merits of the actual presentation, right? So if you have, let's say you have a paper and somebody poses a kind of some sort of a problem, kind of writes some sort of a proof, and then kind of writes an evaluation, you can sort of say the paper is well structured, it kind of follows, but I am unable to check if the proof is correct, right? It's beyond my expertise. So I can only say the structure is okay, the evaluation is there, the paper sounds kind of reasonable, but I cannot prove, I cannot evaluate the proof, right? And then you just say it, right? Because then whoever is making the decision will take it into account. Usually when you're reviewing and somebody has some kind of formalisms or some sort of equations and proofs, you have to make sure that they are correct, right? Which is sometimes a lot of hard work, actually. So I had a paper which was like, 50 pages, out of which 25 were like a lot of formalisms, right? And I could go through all of that, but it would take me a week, right? So then I wrote the review saying that I didn't do that bit because it would be too time consuming. But from glancing over, I said it sounds reasonable, it sounds okay, right? But I kind of made it clear that I didn't actually follow each step of the proofs to make sure that there are no mistakes. So, there might be mistakes. So then, as long as one of the reviewers does the full evaluation, then the mediator can say, okay, we will publish it. But if nobody did that, what should you do? It's kind of a bit of an ethical question, right? Because in science, if somebody publishes something, everybody can read it and comment on it and say, oh yeah, you've made a mistake, and equation 3.1 has a wrong symbol, and then everything which follows is broken, right? You can do that, and publish another paper saying your proof is wrong, right? Which sometimes happens in math. But we try to keep the quality high, so we try not to publish things which are obviously not correct. Right, so then usually you have something which is like relevance. How relevant is the paper to the theme? Okay, so in our case, you can use this. You can say how much you like the essay. All of you will be sort of probably medium, right? None of you is really an expert in a particular domain. Some of you might be. You might have read, 10 papers on performance, and you can see, yeah, I really understand the domain. I can kind of have some insight into the performance analysis. So then you mark yourself as higher expert. And then in here, usually what happens is you have some theme. You have a kind of a theme of a workshop. In our case, we have a theme of the course, but what I would like you to do is I would like you to use this for grading how well the essay actually deals with the topic at hand, right? So is the essay kind of relatively discussing the topic at hand correctly, right? So how relevant is the discussion to the topic? Then you have contribution, how significant is the paper, right? So in conferences, if somebody states something obvious, which everybody knows anyway, then it's kind of insignificant. But if somebody challenges something that everybody understands, but the paper says no, it's not true because, then it's kind of very significant. So you're usually judging how significant something is. So that happened to me as well. So there was a paper written by a student which didn't have evaluation properly done, right? But it had a prototype, and it was challenging the kind of typical way of doing things, right? So I liked the idea. So the idea was very good. It had the prototype. It was lacking the implementation, the evaluation part. So the evaluation was kind of I don't remember whether non-existing or very weak. But I still said it's strong except because it's sort of significant, right? The results they have, the initial results, preliminary results they have, and the idea is kind of worth everybody to know about it. But some other reviewers were saying, well, it's sort of, it requires more work because they should do the evaluation correctly. And it's fair enough, right? If the students spend a little bit more time to do this, it would be a better paper. But usually with student projects, you know, you have a semester you've done, and then that's it. You don't have more time. So adding this extra evaluation would not happen for that paper, right? So then the question is, okay, how should you deal with it? And then the session organizer has to take into account how significant it is versus what are the drawbacks, right? So then, contribution. It's generally like, okay, is it trivial? Is it obvious? Or is it sort of challenging the status quo? Then you have the discussion of related work. So how well the author is basing the conclusions on the existing work, right? So you will see that in the essays. Hopefully you will not see it much, but you will really see it if you read bachelor thesis, right? So if you read bachelor thesis, a lot of time the students say things kind of in isolation of everybody else's work. And it's correct in a sense that they're stating true things, but because it's unrelated to existing work, they sort of are doing it wrong, right? So if you have, let's say, existing body of expertise on performance analysis, right? So you have some sort of papers which deal with performance analysis. And then you're doing your bachelor project, and you did some performance analysis, and you say, okay, we're concluding these things because of what we've done. It is kind of correct, but you're missing the big picture and the big body of work. And you know what may happen is you are repeating what's already well established, right? You might be challenging something that is already well established that it's not to be challenged because of certain reasons, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of reasons that your actual final report should use what you've done, but it also should kind of bring it in, like how well this fits into the picture, right? It kind of fits here, right? So doing the existing body of work usually is missing in the bachelor thesis. In master thesis, if this part is missing, you will fail, right? The reviewers will not pass you, will not grant you a master degree. It has to be there. Otherwise, you know, you've done it completely wrong. But for bachelor projects, you will, like, if you read your own project or if you read somebody else's project, you will see, yeah, we could have done that much more, right? But in bachelor, we sort of focus on the engineering. We focus on you doing that bit well, right? That's kind of a difference between the bachelor and the masters. In masters, we're really focusing on you doing that bit well. And that bit is just kind of a is a slot which fits in. So related work is important, right? So the best one is all relevant work is discussed and cited, and the relationship to submission clearly described, right? So your work with the existing work is well cited, well described, and your work kind of fits into the body of knowledge, right? The weakest one, no discussion, right? A lot of bachelor theses kind of fit here. Several important or key references are missing, and the relationship of references to submission is not apparent, right? So that sometimes is in the master thesis as well, that you're reviewing things, You're saying, okay, people did some analysis of memory, performance, or whatever, and people did that. You review the existing body of knowledge, and then you jump to your work. And there is no apparent link. There is no connection of why you've been discussing that in this context, or how this context fits into this, right? So, and this bit is hard. So getting from, from here to here, it's quite hard, quite a lot of work. Because you have to be reviewing things in the context of your own work, right? So for the reader, it has to be clear why we're discussing these people's work because of what you have here. And it's sort of a circular in a way, right? So even when you're structuring your thesis, it's actually quite hard to do that because you're trying to tell the reader about somebody else's doing work that you need to do your work before you describe what your work is, right? So some form of forward references is kind of usually needed. One way of doing it is you describe your work first, and then you have a discussion where you're bringing on the existing body of knowledge in context of what you've described already, right? So you're first, then this discussion. Some theses are better than to do this first, with some forward references of some of the challenges, some of the things that your work addresses, and then your work is later. And then in the conclusions and in the discussion, you kind of, so you start this first, this second, and you kind of wrap it back in the conclusions again, focusing on this, right? How this fits into this. It's up to you. Okay, theoretical basis of the paper. So, that is sometimes not obvious, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard, right? So it depends on the nature of the work that you're doing. You may or may not require some theoretical framework, but you always have to somehow address what is that you're doing in some sort of a context of scientific inquiry, right? So for your essays, for example, you can say most of your essays will be kind of a literature review based because you're basing your conclusions on somebody else's work that you're reviewing, right? So you're not actually doing experiments. You're not kind of doing kind of experimental methodology, or you're not collecting data. You might do a literature review by collecting some data from other studies and then comparing some of the results. But you have to sort of think, okay, what is it that I'm doing actually in this essay? Right? And most of you will be basically arguing for something based on the arguments of others, right? And that's sort of your methodology, your theory. If you're doing performance analysis, you have some laws, you have some formulas which kind of state what you cannot exceed. You have the information channel capacity, you have the information content, you have some compression limits. So there are some things that cannot be exceeded. So you have upper or lower bounds. So you should describe that. But often we don't do actually a kind of a theoretical computer science. We're doing some applied thing. And then it's kind of hard to put a proper theory in place. But we still do that. So in games, like we have the self-determination theory, right? It's kind of a theoretical framework which is really a bit soft. There is no real sort of strong assumptions, but it is kind of putting things into some categories or some taxonomies, right? So then you will bring it up. So if you're doing some research in games, you may say, okay, how does this work relate to self-determination theory, right? And Simon is using it for some of his papers. So again, you can have no obvious theory behind, which is often the case with bachelor projects. Most of the bachelor projects have no real theory behind it. It's just some engineering artifact that they've built into a clear and strong theoretical basis, well documented with citations and clearly applied into the research, right? We kind of, if you were doing math or physics, you should aim at 5, but with our applied projects, master projects, sometimes that's kind of not really needed. You need, there is a theory there, but the relevance to the research is vague. you should not be vague. You should sort of say what the relationship is. But some theoretical basis with some citations and argument for how it is applied in the research. That's probably fine, right? Okay, then you have the other side of the coin, empirical basis, right? So for your master projects, that's super important because you have to provide empirical evidence, either by collecting it from users or by measuring it, or somehow you have to have it. You cannot really only do literature review, right? Literature review is part of your master thesis, but that's not sufficiently enough for the whole thing. We did have in the past some literature review based thesis which we were trying to do that, but then you will have to have some data collected on the documents that you've been analyzing, right? So you may do some literature review study, which, I don't know, let's say you want to analyze the usage of self-determination theory in game studies, right? So then let's say you've analyzed 200 papers, then you say in 67% of those papers, they've cited this research, right? You have to have some data collected out of the papers, which is not in the papers itself. It's sort of by the meta-analysis of the papers, you bringing it in. Usually you're doing some sort of artifact, you're measuring some things that you've built in your project. So this is what you can do, right? So again, from no data collected, which usually in your case will end up with a failure. If you're doing a meta-analysis of literature studies and you have no data collected on it, then the reviewers will be not happy that it's to sufficient standard. So data collected, unclear analysis, okay, that's not too good. Data collected and good analysis, yeah, that's fine, sufficient, right? Data collected with clear methodology and excellent analysis, that's A level. You have clearly defined the methodology and you have an excellent stats. Sometimes students are here and then the reviewers are saying why you didn't do this statistical analysis or that statistical analysis, right? Valid points sometimes, sometimes not, right? You may say, well, that particular method was, it would not bring much of the value because of the distributions that we expected and so on, right? You can have some arguments why you don't do more, but some students do a lot, right? So this year we had a student who did more than the reviewers were expecting him to do, right? So they said he did more than sufficient in terms of analysis. Okay, and then you have writing an expression, how well it is written, how easy it is to follow, how well structured is the document. So you can do this without being an expert in the field, right? So you have extremely poorly written, hard to understand, to well written and expressed, exemplary writing that enhances the quality of the paper, right? I reviewed papers which were here, which were extremely well written, brilliant, with wrong conclusions, right? The results were just wrong. You cannot do this. You cannot claim what you're claiming based on the assumptions you're making, right? And then I said reject or strong reject, and some people were really liking the paper because it's very well done, right? But if it's scientifically wrong, even if it's a beautiful paper, you should not publish it, right? So it's then you have to argue your point, and I had to say why I said strong reject, because I was saying that you cannot claim what the paper is claiming based on what the analysis was, right? The conclusions don't follow from the premise. Okay, likelihood of generating discussions in the conference. So how that will benefit the field. That was a little bit into the similar to contribution, right? How much it contributes, how much discussions it will generate. So it's sort of the same. And then you have so those are kind of on some sort of scale. You tick the boxes, and then you have a kind of a review that you actually write, right? And you will have to do that. So for our case, after you read the essay, you will sort of add your review, and we will have two types of reviews. We will have a review which is exactly what the format which I just showed you. So you basically say your general feeling about the paper, about the essay, how well you feel an expert in the field, how well structured the essay was, how well it addresses the theme, whether it has a contribution. I will kind of list the points, the main points. You don't have to follow strictly the points, right? And then you have kind of a text where you argue for your mark, right? So if you said the paper is really good, strong accept, then you have to argue why, and you point out what were the strong points of the paper, right? So you can say it was well written, easy to follow, it had good arguments, it had well structured, whatever it is, right? If you say, well, it's borderline, you say what was good and what was bad. And if you say it is a reject, then you say why, what the author did wrong, right? But it's quite short, right? So it's kind of a compact description of what you think for the points that you're making. The second type is a counter argument, right? So each of you will write 3 essays, and each of you will write 2 reviews and 1 counter, right? We have to keep track of who did what, right? Essays is easy because, we have all the essays that you write. But then you have to keep track of how many counter arguments and how many reviews you've done already, right? You only need to do 2 reviews and 1 counter, right? So it's up to you what you pick. The constraint is that for each article, there should only be 1 counter, right? So currently we have 12 essays, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. 12 essays. Each of you will pick an essay, which is different than the one which is there. And each of you will do 1 review or 1 counter, right? If you do 1 counter now, you don't have to do counter again. If you do review, you have to do a counter later. What's counter? A counter argument is a little bit longer argument. It's not a review of the paper. You're not arguing why the paper is good or bad. You're just trying to argue that the paper is wrong and why, okay? You're just trying to bring some evidence that to counter the argument of the paper. So if the paper is saying, self-determination theory should be used in game research, you're saying no, it shouldn't, because, and you're providing evidence why not, right? So you want to say something which is completely opposite to what the author is saying of the paper. Make sense? You can play a devil's advocate, right? Of course, and you will have to do that, right? So even if you read the essay and you sort of agree with the essay and you think, yeah, it's well written, I agree with the points, you have to come up with a counter argument. You have to come up with something which says, no, it's not correct. I'm arguing the opposite, okay? And, whoops, why is that showing? So for each of the essays, we only will have 1 counter, right? So if you want to review a paper and it's already marked as a counter, then you cannot do a second counter on it. You have to pick another paper or do a review. Yeah, in fact, because we have 12 essays, we have 12 people, you have to say which one you will pick. And then we probably should only have 1 person doing one essay, right? Because you will have to do 3. And if you're doing 3 essays, then you will only have 1 review per essay. Yeah, let me think. So we have.
But it's not all of essays. Also, some people didn't write the essays, so it would be bigger. The list of essays.
Yeah, that's right. But there will be also a bigger pool of reviewers. So if someone writes an essay, it becomes a kind of a additional reviewer, right? Yeah, so if we need a matrix. We need kind of a matrix of all the essays and who is doing which essay, right? So how should we do that?
Is there an option like you can leave a comment that I will do a review of this?
Yeah, that's right. You can leave a comment. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so that will work. So then I don't want to tell you which one to do. So you decide yourself. But let's say if Henrik decides to do large review, right? So then Henrik will go to here and then leave a comment saying, okay, we'll leave a comment saying I'm doing the counter, or I'm doing the review of this one, and that's it, okay? And then you will do the review later. So do that. So let's everybody pick which ones you want to do, and then lock it, and then we will have each essay will have one review or one counter, right? I don't want to tell you which counters to do, right? Because some essays are easier to counter. You may read an essay and say, yeah, I can really say against things to what the author is saying, and sometimes you can't, right? Some, like last year, we had essays which were really well done in such a way that the author was actually listing all the positive and negative things, and then the counter would need to reuse the negative things, but they were already discussed in the essay, so it was like kind of really hard to counter argue the essay because it was already discussed, right? So some essays are easier to counter than others. So then you just do a review, right? You have to do 2 reviews and 1 counter, but you will have more essays to come later. You will write 2 more essays in the course, which you will then review and counter, right?
Have we a possibility to change our essay after we applied it? Like this current essays, or we shouldn't do so?
No, you shouldn't do that, right? So what will happen is you should not, so what we will do now is, how much do you guys need for the reviews? 1 week is enough, or should we have 2 weeks?
Some people are absent today, and maybe they, I don't know where they will apply their essays.
Yeah, because the deadline is like today, so everybody should do the essays today, or let's say by Monday. And then if we do deadline by Friday, then you only have like 5 days to do the reviews. What do you think? Look, I mean, we have time. We can do 2 weeks for now, and then we see how it goes. When people get a little bit more organized, then maybe 1 week is enough. So for the next one, we may shorten it, right? But for the first one, let's do 2 weeks. So then you have 2 weeks to write the essay comments and reviews, right? And I will do mine as well. So what will happen is, in 2 weeks' time, you will get some feedback about the essay that you wrote. And this feedback you will use when you write the next essay. So instead of modifying the essay that you have, you will kind of try to make it better next time you're writing an essay, right? So that's what happened last semester as well. So the essays get kind of progressively better because of the feedback you're getting from the reviews of the essays. So what we will do, it's a little bit tricky if we're doing the 2 weeks, because then next week we can't really discuss the reviews because not all reviews are done yet, and it's not good to discuss. Yeah?
Is it possible to do reviews for 1 week and then have 2 weeks for the counter-argument? Because the counter-argument is probably a bit more work.
Counter is more work, yes, yeah. That's correct.
So you can probably, like, at least from my viewpoint, I can probably finish the review within 1 week, but I'm not sure if I can actually do.
Yep, sounds good to me. So do you agree? So we will say that the reviews are done next Friday, so then we can discuss them. but the counters are not done yet, and the counters deadline will be in 2 weeks' time. Counter is more work. Counter is sort of like an essay in itself, and it's actually harder than an essay, because in an essay, it's up to you to dictate the theme and dictate the argument. With the counter, you have to do it against a different opinion. So you have to read the same papers, and you have to kind of extract what mistakes, potential, inconsistencies the author did. So then you point them out, right? So the counter is actually the hardest part. The essays are the second hardest, and the reviews are the easiest. Try to be constructive in the reviews, right? So try to say things that would improve the essay, even if you like it, right? So if you like it, say why you like it. If you don't like it, say why you don't like it. And in either case, say how it could be improved. What do you think the essay could have been improved, or what would you do differently if you were doing the essay, right? It's not easy sometimes, but, try it. So there are two aspects here. One is to give kind of criticism, be honest, but be well-behaving, right? So don't be abusive. So don't say things which can upset other people. But be honest. Like if you don't like something, just say why you don't like it, right? Yeah.
Regarding the writing essays, should it be like more like bachelor thesis when you kind of doing your own work, using some papers, or it may be just a review of 1 or 2 works?
Yeah, so it shouldn't be a review, it should be an argument. So you're not kind of reviewing what other people did. You're trying to argue something that is based on what other people did, right? So there's a small difference. So in the review, you're just saying, okay, this person postulates particular argument, and then he brings particular evidence, and it's either good or bad. That's the review, right? You don't really make your own claim. What we want is for you to make a claim, right? Which is somewhat different to the exact claim made in the paper which you're referencing, right? Because then if you did exact same claim, then you're basically doing review instead of doing an argument. What we want is something that you argue for your own, from your own kind of perception, right? So you say you read 2 papers, they were talking a particular theme or particular topic, and then you kind of come up with an argument of why you can argue something based on those 2 papers, right? Yeah. You get the small distinction? So it's not just a review of a paper or review of 2 papers. It's actually you arguing for something that you believe is true based on the evidence that you have from the papers. But you might be wrong, right? And you could be wrong. And the counter-argument should tell you're wrong because of the other reasons, right? So being right is not a point here, right? You can argue for the things you actually believe are wrong, right?
But you also can make, add some criticism in your essay, or you should just find the papers which you agreed with. Yeah, we had a discussion with PMS about it. You can do criticism. So he had problems finding papers which he could agree with. So he decided to do the criticism of the papers he will be using as the evidence for his claim, right? You can do both, positive or negative, or both. Yeah. So don't get hung out on being right, that's not the point. Doing the arguments right, that's the point, right? So you can be arguing something you really know it's not true, but you're trying to make a good argument for it, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is use the papers only as evidence or as an argument, not as kind of a basis for review, right? So you don't say, oh, this author argues for this and blah, 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 because that's sort of not relevant. What you have to extract is, okay, this author argues for this, therefore it makes
kind of a logical conclusion that this follows, right? So then you're kind of arguing for what you want to argue. And this link can be correct, or you can sort of make it incorrectly, but try to make it correct, right? So again, we were discussing with PMS that you should try to do a good job, right? You shouldn't kind of try to argue for things using broken logic, because then it's not really helpful, right? Yeah, so you should try to make a valid argument for what you want to argue for. Okay, so use the comments to lock your lock the articles that you want, but I want you to read not only the one that you will be reviewing. I want you to read other people's essays as well. So what we will do next week, we will kind of review other people's essays, even if you didn't review them in writing, right? So we will just have a discussion. So everybody should read everybody's essays. And in the class, we will just sort of discuss the review. So, you know, Henrik will have one review or potentially next week, right? And we will kind of discuss the actual review, the written review, but we will also discuss the essay because people will have read it, right? Those are not long things. You can kind of read everybody's essays. And we will sort of have a discussion. So you can post questions to the essay, which you think the author should address, or you should post questions which people may address, right? So you may say, why Henrik is arguing this? Is it correct from that whatever paper, right? So you can post some questions for discussions for next week, even if you're not reviewing a particular essay. And then you should review one, right? So you have to write one review for one of the essays. So maybe do 2 weeks. What do you think? Because then you have to read everything, and yeah, let's do 2 weeks, okay? So I will write on the wiki that in 2 weeks' time, we expect a written review and everybody read everybody's essays. And we kind of spend the session discussing it.
So you can not choose to do counter this 2 weeks?
No, you can do counter as well.
Okay,
yeah.
But then it won't be a review for that, but then we'll
exactly. Then we'd just review verbally and then use a counter as a counter, right? Yeah. So counters are kind of interesting because, as I said, counters are kind of hard to do. And some essays are much easier to do counter on than others, right? And in scientific writing, you often have that. You often have the kind of a piece of research which you disagree with, and you have to do a counter argument. You have to say why, you know, the opposite is true, not what the authors are kind of arguing for. And that is, it's sort of a lot of fun actually. But it's hard because you have to build kind of the evidence which from one hand builds your own argument and from the other breaks the other side argument, right? So 2 weeks, some will have counter, and those which don't have counter will have a review. But let's say Henrik has only a counter, then it's fine because he will get feedback for the review kind of verbally in the session, right? Okay, so I think we sort of covered it. So I have, I will put the schedule onto the wiki, and I will also put a template for reviews, which is used by most conferences. The conferences vary, though, so the multi-choice kind of things, or the selection things, and the written thing sort of differs. Usually the written part has 3 sections. The first section is editorial. So you just say, okay, you know, spelling mistakes, what would improve the flow, what sort of structural changes you would do to make it better, and so on. So it's sort of editorial. It's not about the merits of the work, it's about the presentation of the arguments, right? The second one is the merits, the semantics, like, was the idea good, right? So the paper might be really hard to follow, but the idea might be really good, right? So that you kind of separate the first from the second. So the second one, okay, was the argument valid? Was the presentation logically sound? Was the idea good? and so on and so forth. And then the final one is kind of, so the first two, the authors see. So when you submit your review to a conference, the first two parts and the voting, they see, the authors see that. And the final part is only to the mediator, right? It's kind of a hidden from the author, and that's where you sort of do a little bit of a meta-analysis of the paper, right? So you can say, you know, that's what I did for the students' work. I said, this is a student project. They will not do additional evaluation, but I think it's valuable for the community to see the idea and the initial presentation of the prototype, right? And that's not something you need to tell the authors. That's something you want to communicate to other reviewers and to the decision maker, right? So that the final part is sort of hidden from the authors. It's only to the editorial committee, right? So what do you think you can write, which, you know, the author shouldn't see necessarily, but, you know, it's important to discuss. So, you know, in here we don't have the hidden part. The hidden part will also be seen by the author, right? But try to think what is the meta kind of analysis about the essay that you can put in, right? If you can think of something. If you can't, just use the first two, right? Okay. You don't have to follow the strict structure of the review. It's up to you how to do the review. The structure of the counter is entirely up to you as well, right? One thing that we did discuss before, and also I discussed with PMS, is whether you should make arguments, you know, to our authority or arguments to emotions, right? You can, but you should not, in a sense, right? So, for example, if an essay is making arguments to emotions, you in the review or in the counter you can point it out. You can say, okay, in this sentence, the essay is making authority argument or argument to emotions, right? And it is kind of a negative thing. It should not happen, right? In the scientific writing, we tend not to do that. We try to focus only on logic, right? But of course, it's hard. And of course, you often say things like, which are kind of generic, which kind of appeal to either authority or to emotions, right? So you can say, it's commonly known that mobile programming is harder than whatever, right? What argument is that? Commonly known, right? Okay, it's sort of you know, it is sort of a broken logical argument in a sense, right? But it's sort of authority argument that everybody knows that, right? So you yourself should try to avoid it. But if you can spot it, you should kind of expose it, right? So you can use it as an argument to weaken somebody's argument, right? So you can say, okay, the author is making claims based on authority arguments or whatever, but not on logic, and that's a bad thing, right? Yeah. Yeah, so be nice to each other, but be honest. We didn't have much problem last year with that. Try to be objective. So when you're making arguments about the essay. You're not making arguments about the author, right? So no ad hominem attacks. Like, you know, you don't say the author is stupid because whatever, right? No, we don't care about the author. We only care about the essay. If the essay is making some inconsistent claims, you just say that. You say, in the essay, this sentence doesn't follow from the premise or something, right? You don't need to mention the author, right? And you should not mention the author. You don't know anything about the author, even though we kind of know who is who. You know, it's sort of irrelevant to arguing, to counter-arguing or to reviewing the essays. So if you say, you know, the author is repeatedly making kind of inconsistent logical claims, well, it kind of is okay, but you should not say that. You should say the essay is, you know, repeatedly making inconsistent claims, right? So you should try to depersonalize the review to only focus on the essay itself. Again, it's hard, right? So even myself, I often find myself talking about the authors, right? Which is fine if you do a positive thing, right? If you say, oh, the author is using a very well-structured English and it's easy to follow his arguments or her arguments, right? But even then, you should not do that, right? You should say the essay is doing that, not the author. You can do that in the you can do a little bit of that in the meta-analysis, right? So you can say that, yeah, maybe not. Maybe you should just focus on depersonalizing it. Maybe you should just focus on the essay, right? And the choices the essay is kind of making and arguing. So why we do that? Why we kind of depersonalize it? Well, it's easier to make an argument when you depersonalize it, right? And it's harder to fall into some of the pitfalls of ad hominem sort of arguments. It's also easier to argue, right? Because if you say anything about the person, you don't know, right? You only know facts which are in the essay. So you should kind of base your opinions and base your arguments on the essay, not on something that you imagine the author is like or uses things for, right? So the motivation of the author or the way of structuring the thinking by the author are sort of, you don't know that, any of that.
When you write the review or counter, should you also add links to resources if you, for example, don't know this topic or you are not an expert
Yep.
in it?
Yeah, you should.
But you also need not just to use the references that mentioned in the essay, but also you can find some.
Yes, you can use other references, exactly. And you should definitely do that for counter, right? So in counter argument, you should find papers which say the opposite to what the cited papers say, right? Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not that easy, but you can bring additional citations. For the review, you can do that as well, but you don't have to do it to that extent, right? Yeah. So if you review if in the review you want to say that the paper is making some illogical claims because there is an evidence for the opposite, you can bring that citation, even if the paper is not citing it. Yeah. Should you make the review or the counter depersonalized about you? No, you can make it in first person as well, right? So you can say what you think, what you can use I in the review, or you can say I in the counter. So you should only depersonalize the author of what you're criticizing. So you make sure that you're not criticizing the author, you're criticizing the work.
And what if you don't like the way it's written?
You just say you don't like the way it is written in the essay. And you kind of say why you don't like it, right? So you, as I said earlier, try to be constructive. So for all the things or criticism that you're bringing up, provide some evidence, provide why, right? So like, you say, you can bring, evidence in the form of spelling mistakes or in some sort of sentences which are kind of really difficult to understand. So you can kind of quote things, right? Or some inconsistency in using terms. So you can say, okay, on the first paragraph, the term this was used in this context, but here was used in different context. Whatever that is. So that's part of the editorial sort of criticism. For the semantic and merit criticism, usually you just are citing the actual concepts and the ideas. Okay, any other questions? What I will do is I will put the deadlines here, and I will put the form which is often used for reviewing the articles. but as I said, you don't have to strictly follow the form. But you should sort of address the main parts of the form. We do have, yeah, let me see. If I go, yeah, if I go to an essay, and if I go to a review, there is a score, okay? So 0 means, yeah, it's like strong reject, and 10 is like a strong accept, okay? So there is a kind of a score from 0 to 10, where you can express this, the first sort of overall judgment, right? How valuable is that? It's really hard, okay? Because first of all, you have your own scale, right? What does 7 mean to you, and what does 7 mean to me, right? It's sort of different, right? So if we were, like, if all of us were to give a score for a particular essay, then you can kind of average it, and you can sort of compare an essays which have, let's say, 9.5 average to essays that have 3.5 average, right? You know, you can say the essays which are here probably are better than those which are here, based on 12 people's opinions, right? But if you just have one person's opinion and it says 6, what does it mean, right? Maybe that means that's the best essay the person had read, because that person would give less than 6 to everybody else, right? But you don't know that, like, you don't know what the scale is. So, you know, last year we've used this, but it is kind of hard to use. It's a little bit useless, right? We can do that, like, we can use it for the, as I said, for averaging, right? So if everybody scores everybody else's essays, at least you kind of are self-consistent, right? So you will have some ordering. You will say higher number to essays that you like more, and lower number to essays that you like less, right? But for one-off judgment, that is hard to use. So you can use it, but yeah.
Don't you then also have some assign one of those numbers to indicate that we didn't set a score?
That it's 0 because you didn't
like
set it?
0 is we didn't set it. So
yeah, exactly. So 0 is you haven't set it.
Yeah.
So maybe let's agree that 1 is the lowest you can grant, and 0 is not graded, okay? So if you want to say this essay was really bad, you have to say 1. If you leave it at 0, that means you haven't set the score. We can say, I mean, you know, do you want to use it, or we can basically agree not to use it and then just leave it at 0. Last year we've used it, most people have used it, but it was sort of limited value. It doesn't really communicate much. I mean, the extremes do communicate, right? So if you get 1, it means, yeah, your essay, like, someone really didn't like your essay, or if you get 10, you know, someone really liked your essay, right? But we didn't have a lot of extremes last year. Most people said something, you know, 6, 7, or 8, right? And then what does it mean? It's sort of, yeah, like everybody else's, like it was sort of not very useful, right? But I don't know. I mean, we can leave it up, like. So if you have a case where you really, really liked something, you can say 10. If you didn't really have an opinion, you leave it at 0. Or if you want to give it a score and you have some sort of a consistent metric for yourself. But then again, you know, it only makes sort of sense in a context, right? And you will get effectively just 1 review for your essay. So that number will not mean much.
Do we have to check the private? Is the review views private? Like underneath the score, yeah. Is this a review?
Yeah, that's right. Let me think. How does it work?
Will see it, I guess.
I think if you don't check it, then everybody will see it. Yeah. So I think you should check it initially. We can make it untick it in 2 weeks' time, right? So on Friday in 2 weeks' time, you can go back and untick it and say, okay, it's not private anymore. So then everybody can see it. but initially not, people should not see each other reviews, or people should not see the review. Okay, let's do this. Let's tick it by default and don't untick it, and then we only untick it after the discussion we had in the class. Okay, so the actual review will be sort of hidden for biasing the discussions, right? So let's tick it. Let's make it private by default. And let's not untick it until after the class we have.
And they also couldn't see it.
Say it again?
They're also of essay also can't see
Yeah, the essay author will see it regardless. So if you say it's private, the essay author will see it anyway. Yeah. So there are two roles. There are three roles. And now we will complicate it because we have this anonymous role as well. So it's like, so the first role is of a normal user, normal logged in user. So normal logged in user can see certain things and not see certain things, right? Of course, you also have non-logged in user. The non-logged in user cannot see the list of the essays. So if you go here, the view button is not here if you're not logged in. So the view button is because I'm logged in. If you're not logged in and you go to the event, you will see the essays titles, but you will not have the view ability. You cannot view the essays, right? If you logged in, you can view the essays, and then the author, there is a kind of the author of the essay and the non-author. The author of the essay has more privileges, so the author of the essay see the comments and the reviews, but the reviews are visible to everybody else only if they are public, right? And there is an admin, and the admin sees everything. So if I'm logged in as admin, then I actually see everything, and I can modify everything as well. But as an author, you can modify your own essay, and you can modify your own reviews once they are submitted. But as a non-author, you cannot modify somebody else's work. If the permissions don't work, you can make an issue in the issue tracker as well, right? So I'm sure that things are not perfect. Yeah.
If we were setting up comments
yeah.
about countering or
yeah.
reviewing, the comments don't have any names attached to them. So
yeah, you have to say yes. You have to explicitly say. Well, do we need the name? If someone logs, someone says, "I'm doing the review." Yeah. That's done deal, even though we don't know who that is, right? So it should work. Yeah, so the comments, if you go to this.
Because you can't edit comments.
No, you cannot edit your own comments, and you cannot change them once you submit them, and they are anonymous. So if you don't put your name here, there is no name attached to the comments or questions, right? The questions and comments are basically anonymous, yeah.
But yeah, as long as someone has sort of claimed an article, I guess it doesn't mean who they actually are.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to say who you are by claiming it. Yeah. Right. So each of you will do one review in 2 weeks' time. All of you will read all the essays, and some of you will pick to make a counter, right? For some of the essays.
Is the counter instead of the review? Or?
Yes, the counter is instead of the review. Yeah. Yeah, I think we covered it. We will. So then, in 1 week time. Yeah, let me think about it. I will probably do because we cannot discuss this, and we cannot discuss the reviews, and we cannot discuss the essays yet. We will do that in 2 weeks' time. So in 1 week time, we should have a discussion on something which is not directly related to the essays and the review process. So what I will do is I will post a paper, one paper, that we will discuss next week. Okay? And we use the session for discussing that particular paper. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah.
Yep.
But it's not regarding essay, it's regarding master thesis. So if for bachelor thesis, it's enough like to make some review of work. Aren't we supposed to make something new, like to create a new method, or maybe even technology or something new for master thesis, or it also can be a review, but like some other kind of review?
So you can do a review, but you have to bring something new to the field, right? So your review is new. So, for example, you may, which we partially do with the essays, you may basically make an argument that, let's say, self-determination theory is useless, right? That's your thesis. And you're making the argument by analyzing the existing research in serious games, not using or using self-determination theory, right? And you will make an argument by doing the review of, let's say, 100 or 70 papers in that domain, but your thesis is new. It's like, okay, none of these papers was about criticism, about kind of a usefulness of the self-determination theory, okay?
So it may not consist any of like a practical thing.
Yeah, it can, but it's hard to do it, and then the reviewers usually don't like it. So in New Zealand we had review thesis only, and they were treated the same way as the thesis which built something or which had some artifact. Okay, we did have a discussion last semester, because in the description of the PhD, it says that a PhD thesis has to have an artifact that is contributing to the field, right? And then we had a discussion, what does that exactly mean? Do they have to develop a piece of software, or can they develop a model or methodology? And the methodology itself becomes an artifact, right? Similar thing is for the master thesis. But for the master thesis is a little bit less strict, that the artifact is actually a software artifact. So if you say, in my master thesis I used a particular novel methodology, or if I used a particular novel method of something, then that's sufficient, right? But it kind of depends on the reviewers. Some reviewers are very strongly against theses which don't have a software artifact, and then you have to construct something. But sometimes you can sort of construct an argument only based on the existing reviews, right?
But it also should be connected to your bachelor thesis, or it's not?
No, it doesn't have to, yeah. So your master thesis doesn't have to be connected to your bachelor thesis, and your master thesis can be completely in a different domain or different work. So if you have kind of a novel hypothesis, then it's fine, even if you don't build a software, even if you only do the review. But you can say, can I have a thesis which was already done before, right? Can my master thesis be based on a thesis which somebody else's did? And the answer is yes, you can. The answer for PhD is not, you cannot. But for the masters, you can. So let's say that there is some sort of a master topic. Let's say, let's pick something from last year. So let's say someone was doing a research on generation of plants, right? On kind of procedural generation of plants for games or for something else, right? And that was their master topic. And they had like some hypothesis of what the thesis is, right? And you can say, can I use exactly the same thesis, the same hypothesis? They have three sort of a main hypotheses. And the answer is yes, you can. And you can reuse exactly the same hypothesis somebody else did in the past. You're just doing slightly different work or different work to address those hypotheses and bring the arguments falsifying or supporting those particular hypotheses. You can do that. You can even do so with the same methodology, right? But you have to do something different. You have to, like, if you only repeated exactly the same things as the other person did, then that would be insufficient, because you've basically reused the same software and the same things they've done, right? But if you redo the same methodology, but you re-implement it in a different framework, in a different programming language, or you used, like they've used genetic algorithms and you've used neural networks or something different, then it's fine. You can kind of fit yourself into the existing research. You just kind of changing something, changing the methods or changing the methodology, and the rest of the structure is exactly the same. It's still acceptable for the master project as well. So often it's quite a good idea to read other people's master theses to see what problems they addressed, what was the scope, and how they've done it, because you can get some inspiration and you can redo something differently or contribute, you know, to an existing body of work. For PhD, that's not enough. For PhD, you actually have to have novel hypotheses, and your contribution needs to be substantial. For masters, it doesn't have to be. Yeah. I have a kind of an interesting case. I haven't. We're kind of running out of time. It's 12 now, so I will discuss it in the next session. But I have kind of an interesting case of redoing somebody else's research, and it's, you know, it's more than a PhD actually, and it was a simple redoing, right? And it turned out to be quite a major undertaking. So I can talk about it next week. So any other questions? Great. So thank you very much, and thank you for the stream people.